Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't the ones we can see. Sometimes grief changes not just us, but everything we love, turning gentle hearts' fierce and familiar comfort into something we fear. 72-year-old Eli Zook tends his Pennsylvania farm alone now, watching his prize bull grow more dangerous each day since his wife Martha passed. The magnificent animal that once ate apples from her hand now charges at shadows, consumed by a rage that Eli recognizes all too well. Everyone says the bull should be put down, and Eli knows they're probably right. But then, 8-year-old Maddie appears at his barn door with wild curls and fearless eyes, speaking words that stop him cold. "I can tame your angry bull." This little foster child sees something in the beast that no one else can see. Could she be right about what anger really needs to heal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rooster's crow split the pre-dawn silence like a blade through cloth. But Eli Zook had been awake for hours already. He sat at his kitchen table, calloused hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the leather-bound prayer book that had belonged to Martha. The pages were worn smooth from 45 years of her gentle fingers turning them, searching for comfort in words that now felt foreign to his tongue. Outside, the Pennsylvania countryside stretched in rolling waves of green pasture and golden wheat, painted in the soft hues of early morning. The Amish farmland here in Lancaster County had changed little in the past century. White farmhouses dotted the landscape like pearls on emerald cloth. Their simple lives, speaking of lives lived deliberately, without excess or pretense. Horse-drawn buggies would soon clip-clop along the narrow roads, their occupants heading to tend crops or visit neighbors. The rhythm of their days measured not by clocks, but by the sun's passage overhead. But inside Eli's kitchen, time had stopped 6 months ago when Martha drew her last breath in the bedroom upstairs. Dottie rose from the table with the careful movements of a man whose bones remembered every winter, every long day spent wrestling with stubborn earth and willful livestock. At 72, Eli still carried himself with the quiet dignity that marked his broad shoulders that had borne decades of responsibility, hands that knew the feel of good wood and rich soil, eyes the color of winter sky that had seen seasons of plenty and seasons of want. The kitchen bore the marks of a woman's touch gone missing. Clean dishes sat in neat stacks, but dust gathered in corners Martha would never have tolerated. Her herb garden, visible through the window above, the sink, had surrendered to weeds and neglect. The cheerful yellow curtains she'd sewn still hung there, but they seemed faded now, like everything else in a world drained of her presence. Eli pulled on his work boots and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the sweet scent of hay and the distant aroma of fresh bread from a neighbor's kitchen. The familiar sounds of morning wrapped around him, the gentle lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through corn stalks, the distant hammerfall of Jacob Miller already at work in his blacksmith shop. This was the world he had known all his life, a world of seasons and traditions, of faith and community, of simple pleasures shared with the woman who had made every day worthwhile. Now that world felt hollow as a gourd. He made his way to the barn, his warm boots crunching on gravel that Martha used to sweep clean every morning after feeding her chickens. The massive structure loomed before him, its weathered red siding and steep roof speaking of generations of Zook men who had built their lives around the rhythms of farming. Inside, the familiar smells greeted him: hay and leather, grain, and the warm musk of animals. But overlaying it all was something else now, something that made the hair on his neck prickle. The scent of anger. Thunder stood in the far stall, 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury contained behind oak planks that groaned under the pressure of his weight. The Holstein bull had once been Martha's pride and joy, raised from a calf she'd bottle-fed when his mother rejected him. She'd named him Thunder for the sound his hooves made when he ran across the pasture as a youngster, full of the simple joy that young things carry like sunlight in their bones. Now, Thunder was something else entirely. The bull's massive head swung toward Eli as he approached, small dark eyes glittering with a malevolence that seemed to burn from somewhere deep inside. His coat, once glossy black and white, had grown dull and unkempt. Scars from self-inflicted wounds marked his flanks where he'd scraped against fence, posts and barn walls in his rage. The gentle giant who had once eaten apples from Martha's palm, who had stood patient as a plow horse while she brushed his coat, had become something to fear. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, though his voice lacked the conviction it once carried. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, his massive frame trembling with barely contained violence. The bull had killed a dog 2 months ago, crushed it against a fence post in a fit of blind fury. Since then, no one in the community would come near the barn when Thunder was loose. Eli understood the bull's rage because he felt it burning in his own chest. The same senseless anger at a world that could take away everything good without warning. The same fury that had no target, no purpose, that simply existed like a fire that consumed everything it touched. The sound of voices drifted in from outside, English voices, not the Pennsylvania Dutch of his neighbors. Eli stepped to the barn door and saw his new neighbors across the fence line. The Henderson family had moved in 6 months ago, buying the old Miller place when Johann Miller decided to retire to a smaller house in town. They were kind people, Jim and Sarah Henderson, with their earnest desire to be good neighbors despite the cultural divide. They'd brought fresh-baked cookies when they first arrived, standing awkwardly on his porch while Martha invited them in for coffee and pie. But Martha was gone now, and Eli had little use for English neighbors or their well-meaning attempts at friendship. A small figure darted across the Hendersons' yard, and Eli caught a glimpse of wild auburn curls and a dress that had seen better days. The foster child they'd taken in, he remembered. Maddie something or other. Martha had mentioned her once, speaking with the gentle concern she reserved for wounded creatures and lost souls. "She's got eyes like old pain," Martha had said, watching the girl from their kitchen window. "Child that young shouldn't carry such weight." But Martha had been gone before she could work her quiet magic on another broken soul. Now the girl was someone else's concern, and Eli had enough trouble managing his own grief and the dangerous animal that shared it. Thunder bellowed from his stall, a sound like controlled thunder that made the barn walls tremble. Eli turned away from the door and faced the bull again. The veterinarian had been by twice, along with 3 of the church elders and his own brother Samuel. Their message was always the same. The bull was too dangerous to keep. One of these days, Thunder would hurt someone badly, or worse. The only responsible thing to do was to put him down. Eli knew they were right. He'd been farming for over 50 years, and he understood the brutal mathematics of rural life. Dangerous animals couldn't be tolerated, no matter what sentimental attachment might exist. Thunder had become a liability, a 2,000-pound problem that threatened the safety of everyone who came near. But looking into those dark, pain-filled eyes, Eli saw something that the others missed. This wasn't just an angry bull, it was a creature drowning in the same grief that pulled at Eli's own heart. Thunder had loved Martha, too, in his simple animal way. She had been the one who brought him apples and brushed his coat, who spoke to him in the soft voice reserved for creatures, who couldn't speak back but understood everything that mattered. Now she was gone, and Thunder didn't understand why. The bull charged suddenly, slamming into the stall door with enough force to make the oak planks bow outward. Eli jumped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The display of raw power and fury was sobering, a reminder that sentiment could be deadly when it came wrapped in muscle and horn. He spent the rest of the morning doing chores that Martha used to help with, each task a reminder of her absence. feeding the chickens that no longer laid as well without her gentle care, checking the vegetable garden that grew wild without her patient tending. The wooden gate she'd asked him to build last spring still hung crooked on its hinges. Another project left unfinished when cancer stole away his reason for finishing it by noon. The heat had grown oppressive, and Eli retreated to the shade of the porch with a glass of sweet tea and a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. The Henderson place was quiet now, Jim at work in town, and Sarah probably inside with the air conditioning running. The foster girl was nowhere to be seen, likely inside as well, away from the heat and the strange old Amish man who lived alone with his dangerous bull. The afternoon brought visitors, as Eli had known it would. Samuel arrived first, driving his black buggy with the measured pace that marked all his movements. Eli's younger brother had always been the practical one, the voice of reason when emotion threatened to cloud judgment. Behind him came Bishop Stoltzfus and Elder Yoder, their faces set in the serious expressions they wore when difficult decisions needed to be made. They sat on the porch for an hour, discussing Thunder's increasingly dangerous behavior with the careful deliberation that marked all Amish decision-making. The bull had charged at Jacob Miller's youngest son yesterday, forcing the boy to vault over a fence to escape. The incident had shaken the community. Children should be safe on Amish farms, where animals were partners in the work of living, not threats to be feared. The animal suffers, Eli, Bishop Stoltzfus said gently. His pain drives him to anger, and anger serves no one. Sometimes mercy means making hard choices. Samuel nodded, his weathered face creased with concern. Martha would not want Thunder to live in such torment. She loved all God's creatures too much to see one trapped in misery. They were right, and Eli knew it. The bull's suffering was written in every line of his massive frame, in the wildness that had replaced his former gentle nature. Keeping Thunder alive had become an act of selfishness, a refusal to let go of the last living connection to Martha's care and compassion. But as the sun began to sink toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that Martha had loved, Eli found himself standing at Thunder's stall one more time. The bull watched him with those dark eyes that held too much pain for any creature to bear. Tomorrow, Dr. Peterson would come with his equipment, and Thunder's suffering would end with the gentle efficiency that marks such necessary cruelties. Tonight, though, Eli simply stood witness to grief his own and the bull's in the gathering. Darkness of a barn that felt too empty without Martha's laughter echoing from the rafters. Outside, a screen door slammed somewhere in the distance, and a child's voice called out in the gathering dusk. Life went on, as it always did, carrying the living forward while the dead remained in memory and in the pain of those left behind. But sometimes, in the space between letting go and holding on, unexpected grace could slip through the cracks of a broken heart. The morning came too soon, and with it, the sound Eli had been dreading: Dr. Peterson's white pickup truck crunching up the gravel drive. The veterinarian was a good man, one who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a suffering animal was to end its pain. He'd brought the tranquilizer gun, its sleek metal form resting in a leather case on his passenger seat. Like an instrument of mercy, Eli met him halfway to the barn, walking with the heavy steps of a man carrying the weight of an unwelcome decision. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the maple trees that lined the drive had begun their slow transformation from green to gold. Martha had always loved this time of year, when the world painted itself in the colors of Thanksgiving, before settling into winter's rest. "Morning, Eli," Dr. Peterson said, his voice gentle with the understanding that comes from years of helping farmers make difficult choices. "I know this isn't easy." "No," Eli replied, the word coming out rough as bark, "but it's necessary." They walked toward the barn together, their footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves that scattered like memories across the path. Inside, Thunder waited in his stall, massive and magnificent and mad with a grief he couldn't understand or express except through rage. The bull caught sight of the strangers and immediately began to pace, his hooves striking the wooden floor with sounds like gunshots. The display of agitation sent tremors through the barn's foundation, a reminder of the raw power contained within those oak walls. "He's gotten worse," Dr. Peterson observed, his professional eye taking in the scarred flanks and the wild look in Thunder's eyes. Sometimes grief affects animals in ways we don't fully understand. They can't process loss the way humans do, can't reason their way through it. Eli nodded, though part of him wondered if humans were really any better at processing loss. His own grief felt just as wild and unreasonable as Thunder's, just as likely to lash out at innocent bystanders. Dr. Peterson was preparing the tranquilizer gun when the sound of running feet echoed from outside. Both men turned toward the barn door, just as a small figure burst through it, moving with the fearless determination that only children possess when they've decided something must be done. Maddie Henderson was 8 years old and built like a sparrow, all sharp angles and barely contained energy. Her auburn hair flew behind her like a banner as she skidded to a stop between the men and Thunder's stall, her green eyes blazing with an intensity that belonged on someone much older. "You can't kill him," she said, her voice carrying the absolute conviction that children brought to matters of right and wrong. "He's not mean. He's just sad." "Child, you need to get out of here," Dr. Peterson said, his voice sharp with concern. "This animal is dangerous. He could hurt you." But Maddie wasn't listening to the veterinarian. Her gaze was fixed on Thunder, who had stopped his pacing to stare at this unexpected visitor. The bull's dark eyes seemed to focus on her with an intensity that made both men take an involuntary step backward. "I can tame your angry bull," Maddie said, her words ringing clear in the sudden silence of the barn. The statement was so unexpected, so impossibly confident, coming from someone who barely reached Eli's waist, that both men simply stared. Thunder, meanwhile, had grown completely still, his massive head tilted as if trying to understand this small creature who showed no fear. "Maddie!" Sarah Henderson's voice called from outside, tight with worry. "Maddie, where are you?" "In here, Mrs. Henderson," Maddie called back, but her eyes never left Thunder. "I'm talking to the bull." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with exertion and concern. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent years working with children who carried more trauma than most adults. But even her considerable experience hadn't prepared her for finding her foster daughter face to face with a bull that had been deemed too dangerous to live. "Oh my God," she breathed, taking in the scene. "Maddie, honey, you need to come away from there, right now." "He won't hurt me," Maddie said with the serene confidence of absolute faith. "He's just angry because someone he loved went away and didn't come back." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, their simple truth cutting through all the practical considerations and adult reasoning that had led to this moment. This child, this small stranger who had wandered into his barn, had seen in 30 seconds what the rest of them had missed entirely. Thunder wasn't just dangerous. He was heartbroken. "Maddie, please," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "Dr. Peterson, can you?" But before anyone could move, Maddie did something that made everyone's breath catch. She reached toward Thunder's stall, her small hand extending through the gaps between the oak planks. "Easy, big guy," she murmured, her voice taking on the same gentle tone Martha had used with frightened animals. "I know you're hurting. I know what it's like when people leave." Thunder's massive head moved toward her outstretched hand with the cautious deliberation of a creature testing the waters of trust. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the barn held its collective breath. Then Thunder's velvet muzzle touched Maddie's palm. The contact was gentle, almost reverent, as if the great bull recognized something in this small person that spoke to his wounded soul. Maddie smiled the first genuine smile Eli had seen from her since she'd moved in next door, and began to stroke Thunder's nose with the kind of instinctive care that couldn't be taught. "See?" she said, her voice full of quiet triumph. "He's not mean. He just forgot how to be gentle." Dr. Peterson lowered his tranquilizer gun, his professional assessment warring with what his eyes were telling him. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured. He should have charged the moment she got close to the stall. Sarah remained frozen in the doorway, torn between her instinct to protect her foster daughter and the undeniable evidence that Maddie was in no immediate danger. "How did you know?" she asked softly. Maddie shrugged, still stroking Thunder's nose with infinite patience. "Sometimes animals get sad like people do. They just can't say why with words." She looked up at Eli with eyes that held depths no 8-year-old should possess. "Mrs. Martha used to talk to him, didn't she? Before she got sick?" Eli felt his throat close around words that wanted to come out. He managed a nod, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "He misses her," Maddie continued, her small hand never stopping its gentle movement. "And nobody talks to him anymore, do they? Nobody tells him he's still good, even when he's angry." The insight was devastating in its simplicity. In all their discussions about Thunder's dangerous behavior, none of the adults had considered the fundamental truth that grief, even animal grief, needed acknowledgement before it could begin to heal. "Maddie," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept locked away for months, "how do you know these things?" She looked at him with those ancient eyes, and for a moment he saw not a child but an old soul wrapped in young flesh. "Because I get angry too sometimes, when people I love don't come back." The statement hung in the air like a prayer or a confession, laden with the weight of experiences no child should have to carry. Sarah's face crumpled with understanding and sympathy, while Dr. Peterson simply stared at this small girl, who had walked into a barn full of violence and found the seed of healing hidden beneath the rage. Thunder had begun to calm under Maddie's gentle touch, his breathing deepening as tension flowed out of his massive frame. The wild look in his eyes had softened to something approaching peace, as if her small hand carried some kind of magic that spoke directly to his wounded heart. "Can I visit him?" Maddie asked, looking between Eli and Sarah. "I mean, if it's okay? I think he's lonely." Eli found himself caught between the practical wisdom of a lifetime of farming and something harder to define, a feeling that had been absent from his world for too long. Hope, perhaps, or simply the recognition that sometimes the most impossible solutions were the only ones worth trying. "The community won't like it," he said slowly, thinking out loud. "They think he's too dangerous." "But you don't," Maddie said, with the honoring instinct children had for reading adults. "You think he can get better." It wasn't a question, and Eli realized that this small girl had seen through him as easily as she'd seen through Thunder's rage to the pain beneath. She'd recognized a kindred spirit in grief, not just in the bull, but in the old man who had forgotten how to hope for healing. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat, professional duty warring with what he'd witnessed. "Eli, I have to say, from a liability standpoint—" "Doc," Eli interrupted, his voice carrying a strength that had been missing for months. "What if we gave it a week? If the child thinks she can help, maybe we owe it to Thunder to let her try." Sarah stepped forward, her maternal instincts at war with her growing understanding of what her foster daughter might need. "Maddie, honey, this is a very big responsibility, and very dangerous if you're wrong." "I'm not wrong," Maddie said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "I know about being angry when you're really just sad. And I know Thunder remembers how to be good. He just needs someone to remind him." Looking at this small girl standing fearlessly beside a bull that had terrorized grown men, Eli felt something shift inside his chest. It was small at first, like the first crack in ice before the spring thaw. But it carried the promise of something larger. Maybe healing didn't always come in the ways you expected. Maybe sometimes it arrived in the form of an 8-year-old girl with wild hair and wilder confidence, speaking truths that adults had forgotten how to see. 1 week, Eli said, the words carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. We'll try it for 1 week. 3 days into their unlikely experiment, Eli found himself watching from the barn door as Maddie sat cross-legged in the dirt outside Thunder's stall, a worn sketch pad balanced on her knees. Her small fingers moved with surprising skill across the paper, capturing the massive bull in lines and shadows that somehow conveyed both his strength and his sorrow. "What are you drawing there?" I asked, settling beside her on an overturned feed bucket. His old bones protested the movement, but something about the child's quiet presence made the discomfort seem less important. His eyes, Maddie said without looking up from her work. They're different today. Less angry, more. She paused, searching for the right word with the seriousness children brought to important observations. More listening. Eli studied Thunder, who stood quietly in his stall, no longer pacing or snorting challenges at every shadow. The bull's dark gaze was indeed different, still wary, but somehow more present, as if he decided this small human might be worth paying attention to. "You draw well for someone your age," Eli observed, noting the careful attention to detail, the way she'd captured not just Thunder's physical presence, but something deeper, the wounded dignity that lived behind his eyes. Maddie shrugged, the casual gesture of a child who'd learned not to expect praise for the things that came naturally. "I draw animals a lot. They're easier than people." There was something in her tone that made Eli look at her more carefully. "Why is that?" "People lie with their faces sometimes," she said, still focused on her sketch. "Animals can't. If they're sad, they look sad. If they're scared, they look scared. If they love you, you can see it in their eyes." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive, carrying the weight of experiences that should have been beyond her years. Eli found himself wondering what this child had seen in her short life that had taught her to read deception in human faces while finding honesty in animal eyes. "How long have you been drawing?" he asked gently. "Always, I guess. Mrs. Henderson bought me this pad when I first came to stay with them." She held up the sketch pad, its pages worn soft from use. "Before that, I drew on napkins and paper bags and whatever I could find." "And before the Hendersons, where did you live?" Maddie's hand stilled on the paper, and for a moment, Eli thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice taking on the careful flatness children used when discussing painful subjects. "Lots of places. The Hendersons are nice, though. They don't yell, and Mrs. Henderson makes good pancakes." She looked up at him with those two old eyes. "They might let me stay for a while. Maybe even until I'm grown up, if I'm good enough." The casual way she said it, as if a child's right to a stable home was something that had to be earned through perfect behavior, made Eli's chest tight with an anger that had nothing to do with grief. What kind of world was it where an 8-year-old had to worry about being good enough to deserve love and safety? "I'm sure they're lucky to have you," he said, meaning it. Maddie smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something bright and hopeful. "Maybe. Sometimes I think maybe I'm getting better at staying places." The phrase hit Eli like a physical blow. Getting better at staying places. As if the ability to remain in one home was a skill she'd had to learn through trial and error, through the painful process of being moved from family to family until she figured out how to be the kind of child people wanted to keep. Thunder shifted. In his stall, drawing their attention back to the present moment. The bull had been watching their quiet conversation with the patient attention of an animal who'd learned to find comfort in human voices, even when he couldn't understand the words. "He likes it when we talk," Maddie observed. See how his ears are forward? That means he's interested, not afraid. She was right. Thunder's entire posture had relaxed during their conversation, his massive frame settling into a more peaceful stance. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The difference between a creature braced for conflict and one that had begun to remember safety. "How do you know so much about animals?" Eli asked. Maddie closed her sketchpad and stood, brushing dirt from her jeans with practical efficiency. "I watch them, and they watch me back. Sometimes that's all anybody needs, someone who really sees them." She approached Thunder's stall with the same fearless confidence she'd shown that first day. But now Eli could see the careful observation behind her movements. She wasn't reckless. She was reading Thunder's body language with the skill of someone who'd learned to survive by understanding the moods and intentions of beings larger and more powerful than herself. "Good morning, Thunder," she said softly, extending her hand toward the bull's massive head. "Did you sleep better last night?" "I think you did. Your eyes aren't as tired today." Thunder moved toward her with surprising gentleness, his great head lowering to accept her touch. The contrast was striking. 2,000 pounds of muscle and bone submitting to the gentle guidance of a child who weighed less than some of the hay bales in the barn. "Mrs. Martha used to bring you apples, didn't she?" Maddie continued, her voice taking on the conversational tone people used with beloved pets. "Mr. Eli told me about that. She sounds like she was really nice." At the mention of Martha's name, Thunder's ears perked forward, and his dark eyes seemed to brighten with recognition. Eli felt his throat constrict as he watched the bull's reaction. Clear evidence that his beloved wife's memory lived on in more hearts than just his own. "She was," Eli said softly. "Martha had a way with all living things. Could calm a spooked horse with just her voice, or coax a barn cat to take medicine without a fight. I bet Thunder misses her a lot," Maddie said, her small hand stroking the bull's forehead with infinite patience. "It's hard when someone you love goes away and doesn't come back. Sometimes you get angry about it, even when you know they didn't want to leave." The words carried the weight of personal experience, and Eli found himself studying this remarkable child with new understanding. She wasn't just observing Thunder's grief. She was recognizing it, connecting with it from her own well of loss and abandonment. "Have you lost people you loved?" he asked gently. Maddie's hand never stopped its soothing motion, but her expression grew thoughtful. "My mama died when I was little. I don't remember her much, just pieces. The smell of her perfume and the way she sang lullabies. And my grandma who took care of me after she died too, when I was 6. She said it matter-of-factly, the way children learn to discuss trauma when it became simply another part of their story. But Eli heard the careful control in her voice, the practiced way she delivered information that should have been devastating without letting it devastate her. "That's a lot of loss for someone so young," he said. "Yeah." Maddie leaned closer to Thunder, pressing her cheek against his massive head in a gesture of pure trust. "But I learned something important. Sometimes when you lose people, you get really angry. Not at them, but at everything else. At the world for letting it happen. At yourself for not being able to stop it." Thunder rumbled deep in his chest, not the aggressive sound they'd grown accustomed to, but something softer, almost like the contented noise a cat might make. The bull was responding to her presence, her voice, her understanding, in ways that weeks of professional intervention had failed to achieve. "But being angry all the time hurts," Maddie continued. "And it makes other people afraid of you, even when you're not really scary. You're just sad and don't know how to say it." Eli watched this small girl and this massive bull finding comfort in each other's presence and felt something crack open inside his chest. Here was his answer to the question that had plagued him for months, not whether Thunder could be saved, but whether healing was possible for any creature carrying the weight of unbearable loss. The answer, apparently, was standing right in front of him. By the end of the first week, Thunder's transformation had become impossible to ignore. The bull who had charged at shadows and terrorized grown men now stood peacefully while Maddie brushed his coat, his massive frame relaxed under her gentle ministrations. The change was so dramatic that neighbors had begun stopping by the farm just to witness what they were calling a miracle. Eli found himself drawn to his workshop more often these days, seeking the familiar comfort of wood and tools that had been passed down from his father. The small building behind the main house had been his sanctuary for decades, a place where the rhythm of sawing and sanding could quiet the noise in his head and bring order to chaos. Today, he was working on something special, his weathered hands moving with the practiced precision of a craftsman who had spent a lifetime shaping wood into useful things. The piece taking form on his workbench was small and delicate, a whistle carved from apple wood, its surface growing smooth under his patient attention. "What are you making?" Eli looked up to find Maddie standing in the doorway, her hair wild from the morning breeze and her clothes bearing the honest dirt of farm work. She'd been helping him with chores for the past few days, her small hands surprisingly capable when it came to feeding chickens and gathering eggs. "A whistle," he said, holding up the partially finished piece. "My father taught me how to make them when I was about your age." Maddie approached with the careful respect children showed for adult workspaces, her eyes taking in the neat rows of tools hanging on the walls and the projects in various stages of completion. "Does it work?" "Not yet. Still needs a few more hours of work." Eli ran his thumb along the wood's grain, feeling for imperfections that needed smoothing. "But when it's finished, it should make a sound clear enough to carry across 3 fields. Why are you making it?" The question was simple enough, but Eli found himself pausing to consider his answer. Why was he making it? When had he decided that this particular project needed his attention? "I thought you might like to have it," he said finally. "For working with thunder, animals respond to different sounds, and a whistle can be useful for calling them or getting their attention." Maddie's face lit up with the kind of joy that children showed when adults took their interests seriously. "Really? For me? If you'd like it." She nodded eagerly, then seemed to catch herself, her expression growing more cautious. "But what if I don't stay? What if the Hendersons decide?" She stopped, biting her lip as if she'd said too much. Eli set down his carving knife and looked at her directly. "Maddie, do you think the Hendersons want you to leave?" "No," she said quickly. I don't think so. They're really nice, and they said I could stay as long as I need to. But sometimes things change. Sometimes people change their minds about wanting kids, especially kids like me." "Kids like you?" Maddie shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to the wood shavings scattered on the floor. "Kids from the system. Kids with problems. Kids who've been in lots of different homes already." The matter-of-fact way she cataloged her perceived deficiencies broke Eli's heart. Here was a child who had learned to see herself through the lens of adult failure, not as someone deserving love and stability, but as a burden that might become too heavy for even the kindest people to bear. "How many homes have you been in?" he asked gently. 5, she said without hesitation, not counting the group home where I stayed for a while after Grandma died. "The Hendersons are number 6. 6 homes in 8 years of life." Eli tried to imagine what that kind of instability would do to a child's sense of security, her ability to trust that any good thing might last longer than a season. "That must have been hard," he said. Maddie shrugged with practiced indifference. "Some were okay. Some weren't. You learn to pack light and not get too attached to things." She looked up at him with those ancient eyes. "That's why the whistle is nice. But I don't want you to waste your time if I'm not going to be here long enough to use it." The casual way she dismissed her own worth, as if she were a temporary inconvenience, rather than a child deserving of permanence, and love ignited something fierce in Eli's chest. He recognized the defense mechanism, the way she protected herself from disappointment by expecting the worst. "Maddie," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years, "I'm making this whistle because you're here now, today, working with thunder and bringing light back into this old farm. That's reason enough, whether you stay 1 week or 1 year or 10 years. She studied his face with the intensity children brought to adult promises, searching for signs of deception or false comfort. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Okay," she said softly, "thank you." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, Eli shaping the whistle while Maddie organized his smaller tools. With the methodical care of someone who understood the importance of having a place for everything, her presence in the workshop felt natural, as if she'd always been there, handing him the right tool before he asked for it or sweeping up shavings without being asked. "Mr. Eli?" she said eventually. "Yes? Thunder's getting better, isn't he? I mean, really better, not just pretending?" Eli considered the question seriously. Over the past week, he'd watched Thunder's behavior change in ways that went beyond simple obedience or temporary calm. The bull's eyes had regained some of their former intelligence, and his movements had lost the jerky unpredictability of constant anger. Most tellingly, Thunder had begun to show interest in his surroundings again, watching the other animals in the barnyard, responding to familiar voices, even approaching the fence when neighbors came to visit. "Yes," Eli said. "I think he is getting better. Real better." "Good," Maddie smiled, an expression of pure satisfaction. "I knew he just needed someone to understand him. Sometimes that's all anybody needs." The wisdom in her words struck Eli with uncomfortable force. When had he stopped trying to understand Thunder's grief and started simply trying to contain it? When had managing become more important than healing? "Maddie," he said slowly, "what made you so sure you could help him?" She was quiet for so long that Eli thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned insight. "Because I know what it's like to be angry when you're really just scared. When people look at you and only see the bad parts, the broken parts, instead of the parts that could still be good if someone gave them a chance." She picked up a piece of sandpaper and began smoothing a rough edge on a scrap of wood, her movements precise despite her small hands. Thunder wasn't mean. He was just hurt and alone and didn't know how to ask for help. The parallel between the bull's situation and her own was unmistakable, and Eli felt a surge of admiration for this remarkable child who had found healing for others in the midst of her own uncertainty. "You have a gift," he said simply. "Maybe." Maddie continued her careful sanding. "Or maybe I just know what it feels like to need someone to see the good parts instead of the scary parts." As the afternoon wore on, they fell into the easy rhythm of shared work, the kind of companionable silence that spoke of growing trust and mutual respect. Eli found himself remembering what it felt like to have a child's presence brighten his daily routines, to answer curious questions and share the accumulated wisdom of decades spent working with his hands. When the whistle was finally finished, its surface smooth as silk and its tone clear and true, Maddie held it like a treasure. She tested it carefully, producing a pure note that carried across the barnyard and brought Thunder's head up from his grazing. "It's perfect," she breathed. "Then it's yours," Eli said, feeling a satisfaction deeper than any he'd known in months. "For working with Thunder, or for calling for help if you need it, or just for the joy of making music." Maddie looked up at him with tears gathering in her eyes, not sad tears, but the kind that came when gratitude was too big for words. "Thank you," she whispered Dot as they walked back toward the barn together. Eli realized that somewhere in the process of helping this child heal a wounded animal, he'd begun to heal something in himself. The whistle in Maddie's small hand was more than a tool. It was a symbol of connection, of trust freely given and carefully received. And for the first time since Martha's death, Eli found himself looking forward to tomorrow. 2 weeks had passed since Maddie first declared she could tame thunder, and the changes were evident to anyone with eyes to see. The bull had regained weight, his coat had begun to shine again, and most remarkably, he had started to remember joy. Eli watched from the fence as Maddie led Thunder around the pasture with nothing more than a gentle hand on his halter and occasional notes from her wooden whistle. The whistle had become their secret language. Short, sharp notes meant stop. Long, melodic ones meant come. A series of quick trills was Maddie's way of saying good job. And Thunder had learned to associate that particular sound with the apple slices she always carried in her pocket. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Peterson said, leaning against the fence beside Eli. The veterinarian had stopped by for what he'd called a routine check, but Eli suspected he was simply curious to see if the miracle would hold. "That bull responds to her like she's been training him for years. She has a gift," Eli said simply, though the words felt inadequate to describe what he witnessed daily. Maddie didn't just communicate with Thunder. She understood him in a way that went beyond words or gestures, reading his moods and needs, with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. "The community's talking," Dr. Peterson continued. "Some are calling it a blessing. Others," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "others wonder if it's wise to put so much trust in a child's ability to control such a powerful animal." Eli knew about the talk. Lancaster County was a small place where news traveled quickly, and the story of the angry bull tamed by a foster child had spread through the Amish community like ripples on a pond. Some saw it as evidence of God's grace working through innocence. Others worried about the practical implications of trusting a 2,000-pound animal to an 8-year-old's judgment. "What do you think?" Eli asked. Dr. Peterson was quiet for a long moment, watching as Maddie guided Thunder through a series of simple exercises, backing up, moving sideways, standing perfectly still while she checked his hooves. "I think that little girl has accomplished something in 2 weeks that most professional trainers couldn't manage in 2 years," he said finally. "But I also think the real test will come when she's not here." The words sent a chill through Eli's chest. He'd grown so accustomed to Maddie's daily presence on the farm that he'd almost forgotten she wasn't his granddaughter, wasn't permanently part of his world. She was a foster child whose future remained uncertain, whose stay with the Hendersons was subject to the decisions of social workers and courts and bureaucratic processes that cared nothing for the bond she'd formed with an old man and his bull. "Has there been talk of moving her?" Eli asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "I don't know," Dr. Peterson admitted. "But you might want to consider what happens to Thunder if she goes. Will he revert? Will all this progress disappear?" That was a question Eli had been trying not to think about, but now it demanded his attention. Thunder's transformation was so closely tied to Maddie's presence that it was impossible to imagine one without the other. What would happen to the bull's newfound peace if she was suddenly gone? What would happen to Eli's? After Dr. Peterson left, Eli found himself drawn into deeper conversations with Maddie as they worked together around the farm. She had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things, questions that revealed as much about her own experiences as they did about his. "Were you angry when Mrs. Martha got sick?" she asked one afternoon as they repaired a section of fence that Thunder had damaged in his earlier rages. "Yes," Eli admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "Very angry." "At her?" "No. At God, I suppose. At the unfairness of it all. She was the best person I knew, and she suffered so much before." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Maddie nodded with the understanding of someone who had wrestled with similar questions. "I used to be angry at my mama for dying. No, that sounds stupid, because she didn't want to leave me. but I was mad anyway. That doesn't sound stupid at all. The lady at the group home said it was normal to be angry when people die, even if it wasn't their fault. She said sometimes we get mad because being mad is easier than being scared or sad. Maddie pulled a stubborn weed from beside the fence post. Do you think that's true? Eli considered the question while hammering a nail with more force than strictly necessary. I think, he said slowly, that anger can feel safer than grief because anger makes us feel strong. Grief makes us feel helpless. But you can't stay angry forever, Maddie said. It gets too heavy to carry around all the time. No, Eli agreed. You can't stay angry forever. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Thunder grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally looking up to check on Maddie's location with the protective awareness of a creature who had found something precious to guard. Mr. Eli, Maddie said eventually. Yes? Do you think Mrs. Martha would be happy about Thunder getting better? The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he couldn't speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. When he finally found his voice, it came out rougher than he intended. I think Martha would be very proud of what you've done for him, and for me. For you? Eli set down his hammer and looked at this remarkable child who had wandered into his life and changed everything simply by seeing what others had missed. You've reminded me that healing is possible, even when it seems hopeless. At sometimes, the answer we need comes from the most unexpected places. Maddie smiled, and for a moment her face was transformed into something radiant with joy. I like it here, she said softly. I like taking care of Thunder and helping with the farm work. I like learning how to make things with wood and listening to your stories about the old days. I like having you here, Eli said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in months. Do you think, Maddie started, then stopped, her expression growing uncertain. What? Do you think the Hendersons really want to keep me? I mean, for always? The vulnerability in her voice nearly broke his heart. Here was a child who had learned not to hope too hard for permanence, who had taught herself to prepare for disappointment as a way of survival. I think anyone would be lucky to have you permanently, Eli said firmly. You're smart and kind and brave, and you have gifts that most people only dream of. But what if they change their minds? What if I do something wrong, or what if they decide I'm too much trouble? Eli knelt down so he was at her eye level, his weathered hands gentle on her small shoulders. Maddie, listen to me. The right family, the family that's meant to be yours, won't change their minds about you. They'll see what I see, a remarkable girl who brings light wherever she goes. But how will I know if they're the right family? You'll know, Eli said softly, because they'll love you not in spite of your complicated parts, but because of them. They'll see your tender heart and your old soul and your gift with wounded things, and they'll understand that those aren't problems to be fixed. They're treasures to be cherished. Maddie threw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug that spoke of gratitude and trust and the desperate hope that his words might be true. And as Eli held this brave little girl who had saved his bull and his heart, he found himself praying to a God he'd been angry with for months. Please, he prayed silently, let her find her place. Let her know she's loved. Let her stay. The third. Wheat brought Indian summer to Lancaster County, with days so warm and golden that even the autumn leaves seemed reluctant to fall. Eli had been baking again, something he hadn't done since Martha's funeral, following recipes from her wooden recipe box that sat on the kitchen counter like a treasure chest of memories. The box itself was a work of art, crafted by his grandfather, from cherry wood and fitted with tiny brass hinges that still moved smooth as silk after 6 decades. Inside, Martha's handwriting covered hundreds of index cards, each one a small piece of her heart translated into measurements and instructions. Apple pie with extra cinnamon, chicken and dumplings for cold days, Sugar cookies shaped like stars for Christmas morning. That smells like heaven, Maddie said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with Thunder's lid rope coiled in her hands. Her cheeks were flushed from the morning's work, and hay clung to her wild curls like confetti. Oatmeal cookies, Eli said, pulling a sheet from the oven. Martha's recipe. She used to make them for the harvest cruise every fall. Maddie approached the cooling rack with the reverent caution children showed around fresh-baked treats. Can I have one? That's why I made them. She bit into the warm cookie with obvious delight, her eyes closing in appreciation. Oh, wow. These are really good. Mrs. Henderson bakes cookies sometimes, but they come from a package, you just add water. T.O. Eli felt a small stab of sympathy for Sarah Henderson, a working mother trying to manage a household and a foster child while building a career in town. Store-bought cookies were practical, efficient, and perfectly adequate. But they lacked the love that came from measuring and mixing and waiting for the perfect moment to pull them from the oven. Would you like to learn how to make them? He asked. Maddie's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? You'd teach me? Martha always said the best recipes were the ones you shared. Eli pulled out Martha's recipe box and opened it carefully, the brass hinges creaking slightly. Besides, Thunder's doing so well now that we have time for other things. It was true. Thunder's progress had exceeded everyone's expectations. The bull now followed Maddie around the pasture like an enormous, devoted dog, responding to her voice and her whistle with eager attention. More importantly, he'd begun to show the same gentle behavior with other people, allowing Eli to approach without aggression and even tolerating visits from curious neighbors thought they spent the afternoon in the kitchen. Maddie perched on a step stool, while Eli guided her through the careful alchemy of baking. She measured ingredients with scientific precision, asked thoughtful questions about why certain steps mattered, and listened with rapt attention to his stories about Martha's legendary reputation as the best baker in 3 counties. Mrs. Martha must have been really special, Maddie said, as she stirred the cookie dough with intense concentration. She was, Eli said softly. 45 years we were married, and I never stopped being grateful that she chose me. How did you know she was the one? The question was asked with the casual curiosity children brought to adult mysteries, but it made Eli pause and consider. How did anyone know? What was it that transformed casual affection into the kind of love that lasted a lifetime? I suppose it was the way she saw things, he said finally. Martha could look at a broken-winged bird or a scraggly garden or a stubborn old farmer like me and see not what was wrong, but what could be made right with patience and care. Maddie nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Like Thunder. She saw that he could be gentle, even when he was acting scary. Exactly like Thunder. They were shaping the last batch of cookies when Sarah Henderson appeared at the kitchen door, her expression a mixture of apology and concern. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but Maddie, we need to talk. Something in Sarah's tone made both Eli and Maddie look up sharply. There was a carefulness in her voice that spoke of important news delivered with deliberate gentleness. What's wrong? Maddie asked, her small hands still covered in cookie dough. Nothing's wrong, sweetheart, but we have some visitors who'd like to meet you. Sarah's smile was bright but brittle around the edges. The Johnsons are here. They're the family I told you about, the ones who are interested in adopting you permanently. The words hit the kitchen like a sudden frost, freezing the warm afternoon into something sharp and uncertain. Maddie went very still, her eyes wide, with the kind of fear that children tried to hide behind careful politeness. They're here now? She asked quietly. They're waiting in our living room. They've driven up from Philadelphia just to meet you. Sarah's voice carried forced enthusiasm, the kind adults used when trying to convince children that big changes would be wonderful adventures. They seem like really nice people, Maddie. They have a big house with a yard, and Mrs. Johnson used to be a teacher. They've been hoping to find the right child to complete their family. Eli watched Maddie's face go through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, hope, and something that looked like resignation. He recognized the look from Thunder's eyes in the early days, the wariness of a creature who had learned that good things could be taken away without warning. "Do I have to go with them today?" Maddie asked. "Oh no, honey. This is just a meeting. A chance for you to get to know each other." Sarah's relief at the question was palpable. "But if things go well, there might be some visits. Maybe a weekend. Trip to see their house." Maddie nodded with the careful acceptance of a child who had learned not to fight the currents that carried her from place to place. But Eli saw her hands tremble slightly as she wiped them clean on the dish towel. "I should go meet them," she said in a small voice. "Maddie," Eli said gently. She looked at him with those ancient eyes, and he saw in them all the accumulated loss of her short life, the mother who died, the grandmother who couldn't stay, the families who had tried and failed to make her fit into their lives. "Remember what I told you about the right family?" he said. "They'll love you for who you are, not who they want you to become. But what if I'm not what they're looking for?" "Then they're not what you're looking for either." Sarah stepped forward, her maternal instincts warring with her practical understanding of the foster system. "Maddie, the Johnsons are good people. They've been waiting a long time to find the right child, and when they read about you in your file, they felt like you might be meant for their family." "What does my file say about me?" Maddie asked with the directness children brought to uncomfortable subjects. Sarah hesitated, clearly not expecting the question. "It says you're intelligent and creative, that you're good with animals and you like to draw, that you've had some challenges with placement stability, but you're resilient and adaptable." Eli heard what the file didn't say, that this child had been passed from home to home, that her challenges with placement stability were likely the result of adults who couldn't see past her protective walls to the treasure hidden beneath. "I'll come with you," Eli said suddenly. Both Sarah and Maddie looked at him in surprise. "I mean, if it's all right," he continued. "Maddie's been like family to me these past weeks. I'd like to meet the people who might become her family." Sarah looked uncertain. "I'm not sure if that's—" "Please," Maddie said softly. "I'd like Mr. Eli to come." The plea in her voice was so gentle, so carefully controlled, that Sarah couldn't refuse. "All right, but just for a few minutes." As they walked toward the Henderson house, Maddie slipped her small hand into Eli's weathered one. The gesture was unconscious, instinctive, the way frightened children reached for whatever safety they could find. "What if they don't like me?" she whispered. "What if you don't like them?" Eli countered gently. The possibility seemed to surprise her, as if it had never occurred to her that her opinion might matter in the equation of her own future. "Can I do that?" "Not like them, I mean. You can be honest about how you feel," Eli said. "That's all anyone can ask of you." As they approached the house where strangers waited to evaluate her worthiness for their love, Maddie squeezed Eli's hand once, drawing strength from the connection. And Eli found himself hoping desperately that these people, whoever they were, would be wise enough to see what he saw. Not a child with placement issues, but a miracle wrapped in courage and tied with hope. The Johnsons were exactly what Eli had expected and everything he had feared. Robert Johnson was a successful insurance executive with silver hair and a firm handshake, while his wife Patricia was an elegant woman in her 50s who spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being listened to. They sat in the Henderson's living room like judges at a particularly important trial, their questions polite but probing, their smiles warm but evaluating. "So, Maddie," Patricia said, leaning forward with practiced interest, "Sarah tells us you're quite good with animals." "That's wonderful. We have a lovely golden retriever named Buster, who I'm sure would love to have a child to play with." Maddie sat on the edge of the couch, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap with the careful posture of a child who understood she was being assessed. "I like animals," she said quietly. "And you enjoy drawing?" Robert added. "Patricia and I both appreciate the arts. We think it's important for children to have creative outlets." "Yes, sir." Eli watched the stilted conversation with growing unease. There was nothing wrong with the Johnsons. They were clearly decent people with good intentions and financial stability. They asked appropriate questions, made reasonable observations, and showed every sign of being the kind of parents any child would be lucky to have. But they were looking at Maddie like she was a promising candidate for a position they needed to fill, not a complex human being with her own needs and desires. They saw her surface qualities, her intelligence, her artistic ability, her well-behaved demeanor, without recognizing the depths beneath. "We have a beautiful home in the suburbs," Patricia continued. 4 bedrooms, a nice yard, excellent schools in the district. Maddie would have her own room, of course, and we'd make sure she had everything she needed to succeed. "That sounds very nice," Maddie said with the careful politeness she'd learned in multiple placements. "Tell us about your interests," Robert said. "What do you like to do in your free time?" It was a reasonable question, but Eli saw Maddie struggle with how to answer. How could she explain that her greatest joy came from sitting quietly with a grieving bull, reading his moods and helping him remember how to trust? How could she describe the satisfaction of learning to use woodworking tools or the comfort of baking cookies from a dead woman's recipes? "I like to draw animals," she said finally, "and I help Mr. Eli with his farm sometimes." The Johnsons turned to acknowledge Eli for the first time since the introductions, their expressions polite but slightly puzzled. He understood their confusion. What was an old Amish farmer doing in this conversation about their potential daughter's future? "That's very kind of you to let her help," Patricia said to Eli. "Children need to learn responsibility." The comment revealed so much about their perspective. They saw Maddie's work on the farm as a chore, a lesson in character building, rather than what it actually was, a calling, a gift, a source of purpose and joy. "She's been a blessing to me," Eli said simply. Robert Johnson nodded with the benevolent understanding of a man who had never needed anyone's help, but appreciated the value of teaching children to be useful. "Well, we'd certainly encourage her to continue volunteering once she settled with us. There are several youth programs in our area that focus on community service." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering practical matters like school enrollment and medical care and the timeline for transitional visits. The Johnsons were thorough and thoughtful, asking about Maddie's educational needs and expressing appropriate concern for her emotional adjustment to a new family. But through it all, Eli noticed that no one asked Maddie what she wanted. No one inquired about her fears or hopes or dreams. She was discussed like a precious object being transferred from one careful curator to another, with all parties focused on providing the best possible care while missing the essential question of whether she felt any connection to these potential guardians of her future. When the meeting ended, the Johnsons shook hands with everyone and expressed their desire to move forward with visits. They were clearly pleased with what they'd seen, a well-behaved, intelligent child who would fit nicely into their orderly lives and carefully planned family structure. "We'll be in touch soon about arranging a weekend visit," Patricia said to Sarah. "I think this could work out very well for everyone." After they left, Maddie sat quietly on the couch, her expression unreadable. Sarah bustled around the room, clearly nervous about the silence. "They seem like wonderful people," she said, with forced brightness. "Very stable, very committed to providing a good home." "Yes," Maddie agreed quietly. "And they're local enough that you could still visit us sometimes. Maybe even see Thunder occasionally." At the mention of Thunder, Maddie's composure finally cracked. Her face crumpled with an expression of loss so profound that Eli felt his heart break for her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her and pulling her into a gentle hug. "They don't know me," Maddie whispered. "They know about me, but they don't know me." Sarah and Eli exchanged glances over her head. Both adults understood exactly what she meant, and both struggled with how to respond. The Johnsons were good people, offering a stable home, everything the system said Maddie needed. The fact that they didn't truly see her unique gifts and complex heart was perhaps unfortunate, but hardly unusual. Most adoptive families took time to understand their new children. "They'll get to know you," Sarah said gently. "That's what families do. They learn about each other over time." But Eli heard the doubt in her voice, the same concern he felt growing in his own chest. Some people were capable of seeing beyond the surface to the depths beneath. Others, no matter how well-intentioned, never learned to look deeper than the practical considerations of providing food, shelter, and education. "Can I go see Thunder?" Maddie asked quietly. "Of course," Sarah said. "Mr. Eli, would you mind? I'll walk her over." Eli said. They made their way across the fence line in silence, the weight of the day's revelations settling around them like dust after a summer storm. Thunder was waiting in his pasture, and he immediately trotted over when he saw Maddie approaching. The bull's greeting was enthusiastic and gentle, his massive head lowering so she could scratch behind his ears. The unconditional joy in his response to her presence was a stark contrast to the careful evaluation she'd just endured. "He knows me," Maddie said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He doesn't care what my file says or whether I'm the right kind of child for someone's family. He just knows me." Eli watched her bury her face against Thunder's neck, seeking comfort from the creature whose broken heart she'd helped heal. The irony wasn't lost on him. This child who had saved his bull from destruction was now facing her own uncertain future, evaluated and processed by a system that measured worth in terms of stability and compatibility rather than love and understanding. "Maddie," he said gently. "Yes? What would you do? If you could choose." She looked up at him with eyes that held too much wisdom for her years. "I'd stay here," she said simply, "with you and Thunder and Mrs. Henderson's good pancakes and the workshop where you teach me things and the cookies that taste like love." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they gave voice to the hope he'd been trying not to acknowledge in his own heart. Somewhere in the past month, this broken child and wounded bull had become more than just projects to him. They'd become the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. "But that's not how it works, is it?" Maddie continued with the resigned wisdom of a child who had learned not to expect fairy tale endings. Adults decide what's best for kids, and what's best is usually a real family with 2 parents and a nice house and a dog named Buster. Before Eli could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Not one car, but several, their engines growing louder as they navigated the dirt road toward the farm. Eli and Maddie looked toward the drive where a small convoy was taking shape. 2 sedans and a van, all bearing the official markings that made Eli's blood run cold. Child Protective Services. The lead vehicle stopped near the house, and a woman in a business suit emerged, followed by 2 other officials and what appeared to be a police officer. Sarah Henderson came running from her house, her face pale with confusion and concern. "What's going on?" she called out. The woman in the suit approached with the brisk efficiency of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Mrs. Henderson? I'm Janet Morrison from Children and Family Services. We need to speak with you about Madison Wells." Eli felt Maddie go rigid beside him, her small hand clutching Thunder's halter with white-knuckled intensity. The use of her full legal name carried ominous weight. This wasn't a routine visit or friendly check-in. "What about Maddie?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with protective concern. "There's been a development in her case." We have reason to believe that her current placement may not be in her best interests. Morrison's voice carried the careful neutrality of bureaucratic authority. We're here to conduct an immediate welfare assessment. I don't understand, Sarah said, her confusion evident. Maddie's been doing wonderfully. She's happy here. She's thriving. Mrs. Henderson, we've received reports of unsupervised contact with potentially dangerous individuals and exposure to hazardous farm equipment. Morrison's gaze swept across the barnyard, taking in Thunder's massive form and the various tools and machinery that were part of daily farm life. There are also concerns about the appropriateness of allowing a foster child to work with livestock, particularly animals with documented aggressive behavior. The words were like pieces of a puzzle, clicking into place with horrible clarity. Someone had reported Maddie's time on the farm, not as the healing miracle it had been, but as evidence of neglect and endangerment. Who filed this report? Sarah demanded, a teacher's instincts kicking in when faced with accusations against one of her children. Morrison consulted her clipboard with professional detachment. Anonymous reports are not uncommon in cases like this. What matters is ensuring the child's safety and well-being. Eli felt anger rising in his chest, not the wild, destructive rage that had consumed him after Martha's death, but the cold fury of a protector facing a threat to something precious. Someone had watched Maddie's transformation, witnessed her joy and growth and sense of purpose, and seen only liability and risk. The child is in no danger, he said, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of experience with animals and children alike. Morrison turned her attention to him for the first time, her expression shifting to one of professional concern, mixed with suspicion. And you are? Eli Zook. This is my farm. Mr. Zook, I understand you've been allowing the child to work with a bull that was previously deemed dangerous enough to require euthanization. Is that correct? The question was phrased like an accusation, and Eli felt the weight of bureaucratic judgment settling around them like a trap. How could he explain that Thunder's danger had been born of grief, not malice? How could he make this woman understand that Maddie's work with the bull hadn't been reckless endangerment, but the most natural thing in the world? Thunder is no longer dangerous, he said simply. According to whom? Has the animal been professionally evaluated? Are there documented behavioral assessments? Eli looked at Maddie, who had gone completely still beside Thunder. The bull, sensing her distress, had moved closer, his massive body forming a protective barrier between her and the strangers who had invaded their sanctuary. The proof is right there, Eli said, gesturing toward the gentle giant who stood guard over a frightened child. That bull would die before he'd let harm come to her. But Morrison was already shaking her head, her decision clearly made before she'd arrived. Mr. Zook, I appreciate your confidence, but we cannot base child welfare decisions on subjective observations. Madison needs to come with us for her own protection. No, the word came from Maddie, quiet but absolute. I won't go. Honey, Morrison said, her voice taking on the false sweetness adults used when trying to convince children to cooperate with things they didn't understand. I know this is scary, but we're here to help you. You'll be staying in a nice facility where trained professionals can make sure you're safe. I am safe, Maddie said, her voice growing stronger. I'm safer here than I've ever been anywhere. Madison, you need to understand that adults sometimes make decisions that don't seem fair to children, but these decisions are made with your best interests in mind. As Morrison reached toward Maddie, Thunder stepped forward with a low rumble that wasn't quite a bellow, but carried unmistakable warning. The bull's protective instincts had kicked in, and he positioned himself squarely between Maddie and the stranger who was trying to take her away. The police officer immediately moved his hand to his weapon, his training kicking in at the sight of a large animal displaying defensive behavior. Ma'am, I need you to step away from the bull. Thunder won't hurt anyone, Maddie said desperately. He's protecting me because he loves me. But her words were lost in the chaos of adult voices raised in alarm and authority. Morrison was demanding immediate compliance. Sarah was trying to mediate, and the police officer was calling for backup while keeping his hand near his service weapon dot in the midst of it all. Eli watched this child who had saved his bull and healed, his heart being processed like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. The legal document in Morrison's hands represented the power of a system that measured safety and liability rather than love, that saw risk where others saw rescue. And Eli Zook, who had spent his life respecting authority and following the rules of both his community and the larger world, found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his days. He could stand aside and let them take Maddie, trusting that the system would eventually recognize what he and Thunder and the Hendersons already knew, that she was exactly where she belonged. Or he could fight for her the way she had fought for Thunder, with the absolute conviction that some things were worth any risk, any consequence, any sacrifice. Eli stepped forward, placing himself between Maddie and the CPS officials with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 7 decades learning when to bend and when to stand firm. This was a moment for standing firm. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the measured calm that had served him well in negotiations with difficult neighbors, stubborn livestock, and the occasional bureaucrat. "I understand your concerns, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Zook, this is not a negotiation. We have legal authority to remove this child from what we've determined to be an unsafe environment. Then perhaps you'd be willing to observe that environment before making your final determination." Eli's tone remained respectful but immovable. "Give us 1 hour to demonstrate that Maddie is not only safe here, but thriving in ways that might not be possible elsewhere." Morrison checked her watch with obvious impatience. "Mr. Zook, I appreciate your concern for the child, but we have protocols to follow. Madison needs to come with us now." 1 hour, Sarah Henderson interjected, stepping up beside Eli with the fierce protectiveness of a mother defending her young. "Surely 1 hour won't compromise whatever process you need to follow. Let us show you what Maddie has accomplished here." The police officer looked uncertain, his hand still hovering near his weapon as he watched Thunder's protective stance. "Ma'am, that animal is displaying aggressive behavior. For everyone's safety, officer," Eli said quietly, "may I approach the bull?" "Sir, I wouldn't recommend. I've been working with Thunder for over 3 years. If he's truly dangerous, then surely I would know better than anyone." Eli moved slowly toward Thunder, his movements deliberate and calm. "May I demonstrate?" Thunder's attention shifted to Eli, his massive head turning to track the older man's approach. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the barnyard held its breath. Then Thunder lowered his head in greeting, allowing Eli to stroke his neck, with the same gentle familiarity he'd shown Maddie. "This bull was indeed dangerous," Eli said, his hand never leaving Thunder's neck. "6 months ago, he injured a neighbor and terrorized anyone who came near. Dr. Peterson can verify this. He came here with a tranquilizer gun to put Thunder down." Morrison made a note on her clipboard, clearly viewing this as evidence supporting her case. "But that was before Maddie," Eli continued. "This child saw what the rest of us missed, that Thunder wasn't vicious. He was grieving. She didn't train him through dominance or fear. She healed him through understanding." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Maddie moved to stand beside Thunder, her small hand finding its familiar place on his massive shoulder. The bull immediately relaxed further, his breathing deepening as he settled into the peaceful stance they'd all learned to associate with her presence. "Show them, Maddie," Eli said gently. For a moment, the child looked uncertain, overwhelmed by the weight of adult attention and official scrutiny. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden whistle Eli had carved for her. "It's Surface worn smooth from weeks of use, the first note was clear and pure, carrying across the barnyard like a bell. Thunder's ears perked forward, and he began to move in response to the gentle commands embedded in Maddie's melody. A series of short notes brought him to attention. A longer, flowing phrase guided him in a slow circle around her. Quick trills rewarded his compliance with obvious affection, but it was more than just training on display. As Maddie worked with Thunder, something magical happened in the space between child and animal. Their communication transcended words or whistles. It became a dance of mutual respect and trust that spoke to something deeper than technique or control. Thunder's massive frame moved with surprising grace, his steps carefully measured to avoid disturbing the small figure at his center. When Maddie raised her hand, he stopped immediately. When she moved toward his side, he lowered his great head to allow her to check his ears and eyes with the thoroughness of a veterinarian. When she whispered something too quiet for the observers to hear, he rumbled a response that sounded almost like contentment. Dr. Peterson arrived just as Maddie was demonstrating Thunder's ability to follow complex commands, his truck kicking up dust as he parked hurriedly beside the official vehicles. He climbed out with the quick movements of a man responding to an emergency, his medical bag in one hand and a leather folder in the other. "Sorry I'm late," he called out, approaching the group with professional urgency. "I came as soon as I heard. What's the situation?" Morrison turned to him with obvious relief. "Dr. Peterson, I'm Janet Morrison, Children and Family Services. We're here to remove this child from what we believe to be an unsafe environment. I understand you were involved in earlier assessments of this animal's dangerous behavior." "I was," Dr. Peterson said slowly, his gaze taking in the scene before him, Maddie standing calmly beside Thunder, while the bull responded to her every gesture with gentle compliance. "And I can provide documentation of that assessment if needed." He opened his leather folder and pulled out a stack of papers, handing them to Morrison with the efficiency of someone accustomed to providing official testimony. "These are my reports from 6 months ago, detailing Thunder's aggressive behavior and my recommendation for euthanization." Morrison scanned the documents quickly, her expression growing more satisfied as she read. "This supports our concerns about exposing a child to such an animal. However," Dr. Peterson continued, his voice taking on the careful precision of expert testimony, "I'd like to add a supplementary report to the official record." He pulled out a second set of papers, these clearly more recent. "Based on my observations over the past month, I can state categorically that Thunder no longer exhibits any of the dangerous behaviors documented in my earlier reports. His transformation has been remarkable, and it's entirely due to this child's intervention." Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. "Dr. Peterson, surely you understand that past aggressive behavior in an animal this size represents an ongoing liability risk. Under normal circumstances, yes. But these are not normal circumstances." Dr. Peterson gestured toward Maddie and Thunder, who continued their demonstration with unconscious grace. "What we're witnessing here is unprecedented in my 30 years of veterinary practice. This child has accomplished something that professional animal behaviorists would consider impossible." As if to emphasize his point, Thunder performed a maneuver that left all the adults staring in amazement. At Maddie's gentle guidance, the massive bull carefully lowered himself to the ground, then rolled partially onto his side, a position of complete vulnerability that no dominant or frightened animal would ever assume. Maddie knelt beside him, her small hands checking his hooves and legs with the thoroughness of a trained professional. Thunder remained perfectly still throughout the examination, his trust in her so complete that he showed no concern despite being surrounded by strangers. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Peterson said quietly, "separating this child from this animal would be detrimental to both their well-being. They formed a bond that goes beyond training or control. It's a therapeutic relationship that has healed trauma in ways that traditional interventions failed to achieve. Bishop Stoltzfus arrived next, his black buggy moving at the measured pace that marked all his journeys. The elderly Amish leader climbed down with the careful dignity of his years, his presence immediately commanding respect from everyone present. Behind him came Samuel Zook and two other church elders, their faces set with the serious expressions reserved for moments of community crisis. "Brother Eli," Bishop Stoltzfus said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided their community for 3 decades. "We heard there was trouble?" Morrison stepped forward, clearly recognizing the need to assert her authority in the face of growing local support. "Bishop, I'm sure you understand that this is a legal matter involving child welfare. We appreciate your concern, but child welfare is everyone's concern," Bishop Stoltzfus said mildly, "especially when that child has become part of our community." He approached Maddie and Thunder with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent his life working with both animals and troubled souls. Thunder's response to the bishop was immediate and respectful, the same gentle deference he showed to all the adults who had earned Maddie's trust. "This is the child who tamed Eli's angry bull?" Bishop Stoltzfus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Maddie said quietly, her voice carrying the careful respect Amish children showed their elders. Bishop Stoltzfus studied her for a long moment, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been approval. "And how did you accomplish this miracle, child?" "I listened to him," Maddie said simply. "Everyone else was hearing his anger, but I heard his sadness. Sometimes that's all anybody needs, someone who really listens." The bishop nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd suspected. "Wisdom beyond your years," he murmured. Then he turned to Morrison with the quiet authority that came from decades of guiding his people through conflicts with the outside world. "Miss Morrison, I understand you have concerns about this child's safety, but I would ask you to consider what we see here. Not just an animal tamed, but 2 wounded souls finding healing together. Is it truly in the child's best interest to separate her from the source of her strength?" "Bishop, I respect your perspective, but the law is clear about our responsibilities regarding child safety. And what of the child's voice in this matter?" Bishop Stoltzfus asked gently, "Has anyone asked what she wants?" Morrison looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the moral weight of the question, even as she struggled with legal requirements. "The child's preferences are considered, but they're not determinative when safety is at issue." Then perhaps, Bishop Stoltzfus suggested, we should let the child demonstrate her safety rather than simply assuming her danger. More community members were arriving now, neighbors who had heard about the confrontation and come to offer support. Jacob Miller pulled up in his pickup truck, followed by 3 more Amish families in their buggies. The Hendersons' English neighbors from town had also begun to arrive, drawn by word-of-mouth reports of the conflict. What had begun as a simple child removal was becoming something larger, a cord community rallying around one of their own. Amish and English united in their recognition of something precious that needed protection. Morrison looked increasingly uncertain as she surveyed the growing crowd, her bureaucratic authority feeling fragile in the face of such unified opposition. "I need to make some phone calls," she announced. "No one leaves until I receive further instructions." As she stepped away to use her phone, Eli felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Sarah Henderson, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. "We're going to fight this," she said quietly. "Jim's already called our lawyer, and we're prepared to file emergency custody papers if necessary. Maddie belongs with people who see her gifts, not her risks." Eli nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. For the first time since Martha's death, he was part of something larger than his own grief, a community, united in protecting something fragile and valuable. But as he watched Maddie continue her gentle work with Thunder, both of them surrounded by officials and onlookers. He wondered if love and community would be enough to overcome the weight of bureaucratic certainty. The answer, he knew, would come soon enough. Morrison returned from her phone calls with an expression that mixed professional determination with obvious reluctance. The growing crowd of community supporters had clearly complicated what should have been a routine child removal, and Eli could see the bureaucratic calculations running through her mind as she weighed protocol against public relations. "I've spoken with my supervisor," she announced, her voice carrying forced authority. "Given the community interest in this case, we're prepared to offer a compromise. We'll conduct an immediate, comprehensive safety evaluation. If a child can demonstrate complete control over the animal in question, and if all community representatives can provide sworn statements regarding ongoing supervision, we may be able to reconsider our initial assessment." It wasn't the victory Eli had hoped for, but it was an opening, a chance for Maddie to prove what everyone who knew her already understood. He looked down at the child in question, who stood beside Thunder with the quiet composure of someone far older than her 8 years. "What do you say, Maddie?" he asked gently. "Are you willing to show them what you and Thunder can do together?" She nodded, though Eli caught the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for the rope halter Sarah had braided for her weeks earlier. The simple tool had become a symbol of the trust between child and animal, not a device for control, but a communication aid that allowed them to work together as partners. "What exactly do you need to see?" Dr. Peterson asked Morrison, his professional instincts taking over. What would constitute adequate demonstration of safety and control? Morrison consulted her clipboard, clearly working from a checklist designed for conventional animal training situations. "The child needs to demonstrate complete command over the animal's movements, the ability to stop aggressive behavior immediately, and sufficient control to ensure the safety of bystanders." "Thunder isn't aggressive anymore," Maddie said quietly. But her words were lost in the murmur of adult conversation. Bishop Stoltzfus stepped forward with the measured pace that marked all his important pronouncements. "Perhaps," he suggested, "we should allow the child to show us what she and the bull have learned together, without the constraints of artificial tests. True understanding reveals itself in natural demonstration." Morrison looked uncertain, clearly, preferring the structure of official assessments to the ambiguous nature of natural demonstration. But the growing crowd of community supporters made it difficult to insist on rigid protocol. "Very well," she said finally. "But I want everyone except essential personnel to maintain a safe distance. If there's any sign of dangerous behavior, there won't be," Maddie said with quiet conviction. She slipped the rope halter over Thunder's massive head with practiced ease, her movements so natural and confident that even Morrison seemed impressed despite herself. What followed was 15 minutes of the most remarkable animal communication anyone present had ever witnessed. Maddie guided Thunder through a series of exercises that demonstrated not just obedience, but genuine partnership. The bull responded to her voice, her whistle commands, and even subtle changes in her posture with the immediate attention of a creature who had learned to trust completely. But it was more than just training on display. As Maddie worked with Thunder, the depth of their bond became impossible to ignore. When she stumbled slightly while demonstrating how he could navigate around obstacles, Thunder immediately adjusted his pace to keep her steady. When a car backfired on the nearby road, Thunder's first instinct was to position himself protectively between Maddie and the sound. Most remarkably, when Morrison herself approached to get a closer look at the demonstration, Thunder's response was measured and calm. The bull who had once charged at strangers now stood peacefully while an unknown adult moved within touching distance of his beloved child. "Incredible," Dr. Peterson murmured, making notes in his medical folder. "The behavioral modification is complete and stable. This isn't temporary conditioning. It's a fundamental change in the animal's emotional state. Morrison watched the demonstration with the careful attention of someone whose decision would have far-reaching consequences. Eli could see her struggling with the evidence before her eyes clear proof that whatever danger Thunder had once posed was now gone, transformed by the healing touch of a child who understood pain better than most adults. The animal appears calm now, Morrison admitted grudgingly. But what happens when the child isn't present? What safeguards exist to prevent regression to aggressive behavior? It was a fair question, and one that went to the heart of the bureaucratic. Concern about liability and risk management. Thunder's transformation was remarkable, but it was also intimately tied to Maddie's presence and influence. Thunder has been calm with other people too, Sarah Henderson said, stepping forward with the protective instincts of a mother defending her child. He's gentle with Eli, with Dr. Peterson, with anyone who approaches with respect rather than fear. But the child is clearly the primary influence, Morrison observed. What happens if she's removed from the situation? Does the animal revert to dangerous behavior? The question hung in the air like a sword over their heads, because everyone present knew it contained a terrible irony. The very act of removing Maddie from Thunder's life might indeed cause the bull to revert to his former, dangerous state, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that would justify Morrison's initial concerns. There's only one way to find out, Bishop Stoltzfus said, with the practical wisdom that had guided his community through countless challenges. We test the animal's response to separation under controlled conditions, with adequate safety measures in place. Eli felt his stomach clench at the suggestion, not because he doubted Thunder's continued gentleness, but because he understood what such a test would mean for Maddie. She would have to watch adults deliberately recreate the very scenario she feared most, being separated from those she loved, while others judged whether her connections were strong enough to survive. I don't want to leave him, Maddie said quietly, her hand never leaving Thunder's neck. Just for a few minutes, sweetheart, Dr. Peterson said gently. Just to show everyone that Thunder's healing goes deeper than his attachment to you. Maddie looked up at Eli with eyes that held too much understanding for her years. She knew what was at stake, knew that this test would determine not just Thunder's fate but her own future. It's okay, she whispered, though Eli could hear the fear beneath her brave words. Thunder knows I'll come back. He trusts me. The separation was heartbreaking to watch. Maddie handed Thunder's lead rope to Eli and walked slowly toward the fence, each step clearly costing her emotional strength. Thunder watched her go with obvious concern, his massive head tracking her movement while his body remained obediently still. When Maddie reached the fence line, perhaps 30 yards from Thunder, Morrison nodded to the police officer who approached. The bull with the cautious movements of someone expecting trouble. Thunder's reaction was immediate but not aggressive. The bull shifted his weight nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the strange approach, but he made no move to charge or threaten. Instead, he called out a deep, mournful sound that spoke of confusion rather than anger. Easy, boy, Eli murmured, maintaining gentle contact while watching for signs of the old rage returning. But Thunder's distress seemed focused entirely on Maddie's absence rather than the presence of strangers. The test continued for several agonizing minutes, with various officials approaching Thunder while Maddie remained at a distance. The bull tolerated each interaction with patient dignity, though his gaze never left the small figure by the fence. Finally, Morrison nodded her approval. The animal appears stable, even without the child's direct presence. That's actually quite remarkable. Can I go back to him now? Maddie called out, her voice tight with carefully controlled emotion. Yes, Morrison said, and Eli heard something like respect in her tone. Maddie ran toward Thunder with the desperate relief of a child reunited with beloved family, and the bull's response was immediate and joyful. He lowered his great head to receive her embrace, rumbling contentment as she whispered reassurances in his ear. "I'm sorry," she murmured against his neck. "I'm sorry they made me leave you. I told you I'd come back." Morrison made final notes on her clipboard, her expression thoughtful as she watched the reunion between child and animal. When she looked up, her face carried the weight of a decision that would change multiple lives. "Based on what I've observed today," she said slowly, "I'm prepared to recommend that Madison remain in her current placement, subject to certain conditions and ongoing supervision." The collective sigh of relief from the gathered community was audible, but Eli noticed that Maddie's expression remained cautious. Children who had been moved multiple times learned not to celebrate too quickly, not to trust that good news would necessarily last. "What conditions?" Sarah Henderson asked, her teacher's instincts alert to potential complications. Morrison consulted her papers one final time. "Regular welfare checks, documented safety protocols for any interaction with livestock." And she paused, clearly struggling with bureaucratic language that felt inadequate for the situation she'd witnessed. "And recognition that this child possesses unusual gifts that should be nurtured rather than restricted." It was more than Eli had dared hope for, and yet he could see that Maddie was still processing the emotional weight of having her entire future reduced to a series of checkboxes and official assessments. But as Thunder nuzzled her hair with gentle affection, and as the community that had rallied to support her began to celebrate, something shifted in the child's expression. For the first time since the officials had arrived, she smiled, not the careful, polite expression she'd worn during the evaluation, but the radiant joy of someone who had discovered that love could indeed be stronger than bureaucracy. As the official vehicles finally pulled away, leaving dust clouds that settled like the remnants of a storm, Eli found himself standing in a barnyard transformed by more than just the day's events. The community members who had rallied to support Maddie were lingering, reluctant to let the moment pass without acknowledgement of what they'd witnessed. Bishop Stoltzfus approached Eli with the measured steps of a man carrying important words. "Brother Eli," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided their community for decades, "we need to speak." Eli nodded, though part of him wanted nothing more than to retreat to the quiet of his workshop and process the emotional upheaval of the day. Maddie was still with Thunder, her small arms wrapped around the bull's massive neck as if she could anchor herself to the security of his presence. "The child cannot return to uncertainty," Bishop Stoltzfus continued. "What we witnessed today, her gift, her healing of Thunder, her courage in the face of those who would separate her from what she loves, these things speak to purpose, to calling." "I agree," Eli said simply, though he sensed there was more coming. "The Hendersons are good people, but they struggle with the permanence the child needs. Foster care, however loving, carries the weight of temporariness." The bishop's weathered hands clasped behind his back as he considered his next words. "You have found purpose again through this child, just as she has found healing through your bull." Eli felt his heart begin to beat faster, though he tried to keep his expression calm. "What are you suggesting, Bishop?" "I am suggesting that sometimes God's plan reveals itself through the most unexpected pathways. Martha is gone. May she rest in peace. But perhaps her final gift to you was preparing your heart to love again." The words hit Eli with stunning force, not because they were unexpected, but because they gave voice to hopes he'd been afraid to acknowledge, even to himself. In the weeks since Maddie had first appeared in his barn, she had become more than just a helper or even a friend. She had become the granddaughter he and Martha had never been blessed to have. "The legal complexities," Eli began, "can be navigated," Bishop Stoltzfus finished gently. "Sarah Henderson has already spoken with me. She and her husband recognized that their role was to provide temporary sanctuary while the child found her true home. They believe, as I do, that she has found it." Eli looked across the barnyard to where Maddie sat in the dirt beside Thunder, Her sketchpad balanced on her knees as she captured some detail of the bull's gentle expression. The sight was so natural, so perfectly right, that he wondered how he had ever imagined his life without her in it. She would have to leave everything she's known again, Eli said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Would she? Bishop Stoltzfus asked mildly. The Hendersons live next door. Dr. Peterson has become invested in her welfare. The community has seen her gifts and accepted her as one of our own. What would she be leaving, except the uncertainty of not knowing where she truly belongs? Before Eli could respond, Maddie herself approached, her sketchpad tucked under one arm and her expression serious with the weight of important things to say. "Mr. Eli," she said, her voice carrying the careful precision children used when addressing subjects that mattered more than anything else in their world. "Mrs. Henderson told me that you and the bishop were talking about important things." "We were," Eli admitted. "About me?" "About your future, yes." Maddie nodded as if she'd expected as much. "I heard some of what that lady said about the Johnsons, about how they have a nice house and want to adopt someone permanently." Eli felt his chest tighten with the fear that this remarkable child might choose security over the uncertain affection of an old Amish farmer and his gentle bull. "They seemed like good people," he said carefully. "They did," Maddie agreed. "But they looked at me like I was a puzzle they wanted to solve, not like I was someone they wanted to know." She shifted her weight from foot to foot, gathering courage for what came next. "You look at me like I already make sense just the way I am." The simple statement contained such profound insight that both men were momentarily speechless. Here was a child who understood the difference between being wanted for what you might become and being loved for who you already were. "Maddie," Eli said gently, "what do you want? If you could choose any family, any future, what would make you happiest?" She looked at him with those ancient eyes, and Eli saw in them not just intelligence but wisdom earned through experiences no child should have to navigate alone. "I want to stay here," she said simply, "with you and Thunder and the workshop, where you teach me things, and the kitchen where we make cookies from Mrs. Martha's recipes. I want to learn how to take care of the farm and maybe have my own animals someday and draw pictures of everything beautiful I see." She paused, her gaze shifting to Thunder, who had wandered over to investigate their serious conversation. "But mostly I want to be somewhere that I don't have to worry about being good enough to keep. I want to be somewhere that feels like forever." Eli knelt down so he was at her eye level, his weathered hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Maddie, if I asked you to stay here permanently, not as a foster child or a temporary arrangement, but as my granddaughter in every way that matters, what would you say?" The transformation in her face was immediate and radiant. The careful guardedness that had become her default expression melted away, replaced by joy so pure and bright that it seemed to illuminate the entire barnyard. "I would say yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I would say yes 1,000 times." Eli pulled her into his arms, feeling his own tears fall freely for the first time since Martha's funeral. But these weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of healing, of a heart that had discovered it was capable of loving again in ways he'd never thought possible. "Then, that's what we'll do," he said into her hair, which smelled of hay and sunshine and the particular sweetness of childhood. "We'll make it legal and proper and permanent. You'll be a Zook, if you want to be." "I want to be," she said fiercely, her small arms tight around his neck. "I want to be a Zook and live here forever and take care of Thunder and learn everything you can teach me." Bishop Stoltzfus watched the reunion with the satisfied expression of a man who had helped guide two lost souls toward the home they were meant to share. But as Eli held this precious child and felt the pieces of his broken heart finally beginning to heal, he realized that Martha's greatest gift hadn't been her recipes or her garden, or even her years of faithful love. Her greatest gift had been preparing his heart to recognize family when it arrived in the most unexpected form. A wild-haired foster child with ancient eyes and the miraculous ability to see healing where others saw only brokenness. From his pocket, Eli pulled out something he'd carried every day since Martha's death, but hadn't been able to look at: his wedding ring, worn smooth by decades of faithful marriage. He held it up to catch the late afternoon light, remembering the day Martha had slipped its mate onto her own finger with promises that had lasted until her final breath. But now, as he looked at this symbol of love that had defined his life for 45 years, Eli understood that some bonds weren't meant to be worn forever. Some treasures were meant to be carefully stored, honored, but not clung to, making space for new forms of love to take root and grow. He walked to the fence post, where Martha's favorite climbing rose still bloomed despite his neglect, and carefully placed the ring at the base of the plant. It wasn't goodbye. It was recognition that the love Martha had taught him was strong enough to expand, generous enough to embrace this unexpected child who had brought healing to his wounded world. "Thank you," he whispered to the memory of his beloved wife. "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't end. It just finds new ways to grow." As he turned back toward Maddie and Thunder, Eli Zook felt something he hadn't experienced in months. The quiet joy of a man who had discovered that sometimes the most broken hearts were simply making room for more love than they'd ever dreamed possible. 6 months later, the morning rooster's crow found Eli Zook already awake, but not from grief-stricken insomnia this time. He was awake because Maddie had been up before dawn, as she was every morning now, eager to begin the day's work with Thunder and the other animals that had gradually joined their small farm family. From his bedroom window, Eli could see her in the pasture, brushing Thunder's coat while chattering away about her plans for the day. The bull listened with the patient attention of a beloved grandfather, occasionally rumbling responses that made her laugh with delight. The sight never failed to fill Eli's chest with the kind of contentment he'd thought was lost forever. The adoption had been finalized 3 months ago, with legal proceedings that were remarkably smooth thanks to the combined efforts of the Hendersons, Bishop Stoltzfus, and a family court judge who understood that love came in many forms. Maddie Zook, the name still made Eli smile, had officially become his granddaughter, though their bond had felt permanent long before the paperwork made it legal. The kitchen counter no longer displayed just Martha's recipe box. Beside it sat a new wooden sign that Eli had carved with careful precision: Zook Family Farm, Est, 1952, renewed 2024. The addition had been Maddie's idea, her way of honoring both the farm's history and its future. "Good morning, Grandpa Eli," Maddie called as she came through the kitchen door, her boots muddy and her cheeks flushed with the healthy glow of outdoor work. At 9 years old now, she had grown taller and more confident, but she still carried herself with the careful awareness of someone who had learned not to take stability for granted. "Good morning, granddaughter," Eli replied, the words still carrying a touch of wonder even after months of daily use. "How's Thunder this morning?" "Happy," she said simply, settling at the kitchen table with the easy familiarity of a child who had never doubted her welcome there. "He keeps looking toward the south pasture. I think he knows the new calf is coming soon." Martha's prize Holstein, Daisy, was indeed expected to give birth any day now. The pregnancy had been unexpected, a final gift from the bull who had serviced the herd before Thunder's period of dangerous grief. But Maddie had taken charge of monitoring the expectant mother with the same intuitive care she'd shown Thunder, and Dr. Peterson had proclaimed her observations more accurate than most professional assessments. "Dr. Peterson's coming by this afternoon to check on Daisy," Eli said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and fresh biscuits in front of his granddaughter. "Would you like to assist with the examination?" Maddie's face lit up with enthusiasm. Over the past months, she'd become Dr. Peterson's unofficial apprentice, accompanying him on routine farm calls and displaying such natural veterinary instincts that he'd already begun talking about scholarship opportunities when she was old enough for formal education. "Can I use the stethoscope to listen to the calf's heartbeat?" I'm sure Dr. Peterson would be honored to have such a skilled assistant. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the easy quiet of family members who had learned to find peace in each other's presence. Through the window, they could see Thunder grazing contentedly in the early morning light, his coat gleaming with health and his movements free from the tension that had once defined him. The transformation hadn't been limited to the bull. The entire farm seemed to have awakened from the grief-stricken sleep that had settled over it after Martha's death. Vegetables grew again in the garden, tended by Maddie's careful hands and watered with knowledge gleaned from Martha's detailed journals. Chickens laid consistently under Maddie's gentle care, and even the barn cats had emerged from their hiding places to seek attention from this small person, who understood their need for both affection and independence. "Grandpa Eli," Maddie said as she finished the last of her breakfast. "Mrs. Henderson asked if I wanted to come to dinner Sunday to meet her sister's family. They're visiting from Ohio. Would you like to go?" Maddie considered the question with the thoughtfulness she brought to all decisions, large and small. "I think so. But I want to make sure Thunder will be okay without me for a few hours." It was a response that perfectly captured both her growth and her continued connection to the bull who had been her first patient. She no longer feared that every separation might be permanent, but she also never forgot her responsibility to those who depended on her care. "Thunder will be fine," Eli assured her, "but it's good that you always consider his needs." After breakfast, they walked together to the barn, where Thunder waited with the patient expectation of a creature whose days were ordered by routine and affection rather than fear and uncertainty. Maddie's morning ritual with him had evolved into something beautiful to witness, part health check, part conversation, part pure communion between kindred spirits. "Good morning, beautiful boy," she murmured as she approached his stall. Thunder lowered his massive head for her greeting, rumbling contentment as she scratched behind his ears. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about the new calf again. I think it's going to be a girl, and I think she's going to have your gentle eyes." As Maddie worked with Thunder, Eli found himself drawn to his workshop, where a new project waited on his workbench. It was a larger piece than the whistle he'd carved for her months ago, a detailed carving of a girl and a bull, their poses capturing the moment of their first meeting with artistic precision that surprised even him. The carving was intended as a gift for Maddie's 10th birthday, still several months away, but Eli found himself working on it whenever he had a quiet moment. Something about translating their story into wood felt important, like creating a permanent record of the moment when healing had first become possible. "That's beautiful," a voice said behind him. Eli turned to find Sarah Henderson standing in the workshop doorway, her expression warm with the affection that had never wavered despite the changes in their living arrangements. "Sarah," Eli said, setting down his carving tools. "Come in, please." She approached the workbench with obvious admiration for his craftsmanship. "Is this for Maddie's birthday?" "Yes, though I'm not sure she needs reminders of how far she's come." "We all need reminders sometimes," Sarah said gently, "especially of the moments when everything changed for the better." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching through the workshop window as Maddie led Thunder through his morning exercises. The sight had become routine, but it never lost its power to inspire wonder. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, quietly, taking on the responsibility of raising a child at your age. Eli considered the question seriously, as he did all of Sarah's thoughtful inquiries. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what Martha always knew, that love doesn't diminish when you share it. It multiplies." Sarah smiled, the expression of a woman who had found peace with a difficult decision. "Jim and I have been talking about fostering again. There are so many children who need what we were able to give Maddie, even if it's just temporary safety while they find their permanent homes. You have gifts for that work, Eli said. Maddie often speaks of how safe you made her feel during her time with you. She made us better people, Sarah replied, just like she made you and Thunder better. That's her gift. I think helping others remember who they're supposed to be. As if summoned by their conversation, Maddie appeared in the workshop doorway, her morning chores completed and her face bright with anticipation for the day's possibilities. "Dr. Peterson's here," she announced. "He says Daisy's definitely going into labor soon, maybe even today." The next few hours passed in the focused excitement that accompanied new life arriving on a farm. Dr. Peterson confirmed Maddie's observations about Daisy's condition, and by early afternoon, the first signs of active labor were evident. Maddie stationed herself in the birthing stall with the dedication of a midwife, monitoring Daisy's progress and offering gentle encouragement. Thunder, meanwhile, had positioned himself at the pasture fence closest to the barn, as if he understood his role as protective guardian of the farm's newest arrival. His transformation from dangerous outcast to beloved patriarch seemed complete as he stood vigil over the birth that would expand their small family. When the calf finally arrived, a healthy heifer with Thunder's gentle eyes, just as Maddie had predicted, the joy in the barn was palpable. Dr. Peterson handled the medical aspects of the birth, while Maddie provided comfort to both mother and baby, her soft voice and gentle touches helping them through the vulnerable first moments of their new relationship. "She's perfect," Maddie breathed, watching as the calf struggled to her feet with the determined awkwardness of new life finding its balance. "What should we name her?" Eli asked. Maddie considered the question with characteristic seriousness, studying the calf's markings and temperament before making her decision. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name should be Hope." As the sun began to set over Lancaster County, painting the sky in the amber and rose hues that Martha had loved, Eli found himself standing in the barnyard, surrounded by the life that had grown around him in the months since a small girl had declared she could tame his angry bull. Thunder grazed peacefully in the pasture, his coat gleaming with health. Daisy nursed her new calf in the barn while Maddie kept watch with protective devotion. The vegetables in Martha's garden grew strong and true under his granddaughter's care. The chickens roosted contentedly, and even the barn cats had begun to seek out human affection after months of patient gentleness from their new caretaker. But more than the animals and crops, Eli had found something he'd thought was lost forever: the quiet satisfaction of a life lived in service to those who depended on his care. The responsibility of raising Maddie had awakened purposes he'd forgotten he possessed, while her presence had filled the house with laughter and conversation, and the particular chaos that followed children and their boundless energy. "Grandpa." "Eli," Maddie said, appearing beside him with the silent grace she'd developed from months of moving carefully around large animals. "Do you think Mrs. Martha would be happy about Hope being born?" The question caught him off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it carried such perfect understanding of the connections that bound past, present, and future together. "I think Martha would be overjoyed," he said softly. She always believed that new life was God's way of reminding us that hope never really dies. It just waits for the right moment to be born again. Maddie nodded with satisfaction, as if his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. "I like that. I like thinking that hope is Martha's way of saying hello." As they walked back toward the house together, Eli's hand resting gently on his granddaughter's shoulder, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a broken man contemplating the destruction of a beloved animal because grief had made both of them too dangerous to trust with their own pain. Now he was a grandfather again, watching his child discover her calling, while surrounded by the abundance of a farm restored to purpose. Thunder had become the gentle giant Martha had always believed he could be. And somewhere in the process of healing others, Eli had discovered that his own heart was capable of holding far more love than he'd ever imagined possible. The house that had felt empty and cold for so many months was warm with the sounds of family Maddie's questions about tomorrow's chores. The gentle bubbling of soup on the stove, the soft tick of the clock that marked time moving forward rather than standing still in grief. And in Martha's recipe box, now worn smooth by Maddie's eager fingers, new recipes were beginning to appear, innovations and improvements written in a child's careful handwriting, proof that love's legacy lived on in unexpected ways. Sometimes, Eli thought as he watched his granddaughters set the table for their evening meal, the greatest miracles came disguised as the most ordinary moments: a child taming an angry bull, a man learning to love again, a family being born from the ashes of loss, and the courage to hope for something better. Outside, thunder's gentle lowing drifted across the pasture as he called goodnight to the farm he protected. And in the barn, a calf named Hope took her first, uncertain steps toward a future that promised all the abundance that patient love could provide.